Hey folks, Kele here with Barb French, and we're giving you a bird's eye view of the kind of work we do up here at Braddock Bay Raptor Research. So in the last video we kind of touched on just Braddock Bay in general, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth here with a little bit of research on birds of prey. So why is it important to study birds of prey?
Well, birds of prey tell you a lot about what's going on in the environment. If there are problems going on farther down in the food chain, you don't necessarily see it with the bunnies and the little birds and such like that. You'll see it much farther up in the food chain. So if we suddenly see that a species of bird of prey is having problems, their numbers are declining, we're not seeing them in areas we're expecting them to see, we have to look at some of the environmental factors that are going on to figure out why it is that they're having this problem. For example, I'm sorry to tell you this, Kele, but the kestrels are kind of in trouble right now.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and it seems to have leveled off, but we're trying to figure out why it is that the kestrels are having such problems. As you know, starlings are a big issue for you guys.
Oh, yes.
They take over your nest.
Oh, yeah. Me and starlings,
But, for example, there was just a paper that came out that said that one of the problems that they have is when they're spraying for insects, they're taking away a lot of your food.
You know how much I love grasshoppers.
Yeah, and they're killing off the insects.
Ah.
So, in areas where there's heavy use of pesticides, mostly to get rid of mosquitoes, kestrels are disappearing from those areas. So we have to see what the impact of what we're doing to our environment is having, and the only way we can see this sometimes is to look at those top-level predators. That's why it's so important to study raptors.
Take note of that, people at home. Alright, so what sort of birds of prey do you most commonly see here up at the Braddock Bay area?
Well, the three most numerous species that we see at the banding station are the sharp-shinned hawk, the red-tailed hawk, and the Cooper's hawk. But the most numerous bird that we see here during migration is the broad-winged hawk, because they tend to come in huge, huge numbers. They come up all the way from Central America and some from South America on their migrations. And we might see several thousand of them in a single day. It's incredible to watch. The sky is just filled with these birds. But they don't tend to come down into the banding station because they mostly hunt from short perches, and they hunt frogs and snakes and that sort of thing. So they're not really interested in this big field that we've got.
That makes sense. So when you're out counting various birds, how do you identify something that's a little too far away to get a good, accurate look at it?
Well, sometimes it's so far away you can't. It's just a little speck in the air. I can't anyway. It's something it's a skill you have to develop over time and looking at it. I'm getting better. I've only been doing this for about 4 years. So I'm getting better over time, but you want to look at shape and you want to look at behavior. Like, for example, a turkey vulture. Big V, big deep V a lot of the time, but sometimes when it's windy it flattens out. So you're going, is that a vulture or is that an eagle? And here's another thing about vultures, they wobble. So if it's wobbling, it's not an eagle, because bald eagles in particular, they're dead flat. They're like a board right across their backs, but they never wobble. They're always perfectly straight. And like red tails, they tend to swoop in big circles, broad wings in little tiny circles. And you learn to look at the wing flap. You look at all those little things out there when all they are is a little shape.
Wow, that's something I didn't know. Okay, so I know you touched on this a little bit in the last video, but roughly in a given season, how many birds would you say might fly through the Braddock Bay area?
Well, we count about 50,000. I'm sure that's only in just one small area. The actual number is probably much, much higher than that because, well, we're only counting a certain number of hours a day, and so some may come through a little earlier, some might come through later. It's mostly we count pretty much while there's daylight, and hawks don't move at night, but owls do. So that's one where we don't know exactly how many are going through because most of those are traveling at night. So the number is probably much, much higher than that.
I didn't even think of owls. How about that? Alright, so about what time does the migration start in the spring, and what time does it also start in the fall?
Well, we don't really get a true fall migration. What we get in the fall is red-tailed hawks who have just hatched this year, who kind of go through this false north migration. We call it, these are big words, a red-tailed natal dispersal. Natal being they're just born, and dispersal meaning they're scattering around. Their parents have kicked them out of the nest and they got to go fend for themselves, so they kind of start going north on the southwest winds that push them up against the lake. So it's not a real migration as such, but they don't know what they're doing yet. So they'll figure it out, and eventually they turn around and go south with the rest of them in the fall. But the spring migration, and the natal dispersal generally goes from August and September and sort of into October. The spring migration, we start counting at the beginning of March, but it doesn't really start picking up until late March, early April, and our peak season is kind of in late April. It was a little later this year. Sometimes weather changes can affect the migration. When we had those really cold winters, it came through later. If we have a really warm winter, it can start earlier. But generally between beginning of March and the end of May.
Interesting. Do you see any cool birds of prey from the cold north that come through?
Very occasionally. We call those migrants. We have about 15 species that we see all the time, but like a couple of years ago we got a gyrfalcon.
Wow.
And I got to see it. I wasn't even sure that's what it was, but someone else had seen it. One of our hawk counters had seen it, and someone else got a picture of it. And it's just an incredible bird. We don't see those very often. Those are an Arctic species. And occasionally we'll get something that's a western United States species, such as the Swainson's hawk, that'll come through. So we don't get those very often, but they're really exciting when we do see them.
Yeah, that does sound pretty exciting. Alright, so I'll close this video out with one last question. Out of all the species of bird of prey that you see fly through here, which is your favorite?
Well, I'm kind of alone in this one, because everyone seems to like the really big ones. Like our master bander loves eagles, and everyone seems to love the red tails, but I'm a fan of the sharp-shinned hawk. They're one of the smallest ones that we deal with. And I'm very partial to kestrels also.
Aww. Alright folks, that wraps it up for this episode of Bird's Eye View. Keep your eye out for the next one. We're going to go in a little bit more in depth on how the banding process works. So see you there.